The sound of steel striking earth filled the autumn air as Grace Evans drove her shovel deep into the hard Arizona soil, her back aching from hours of digging fence post holes. The year was 1885, and the Rocking E Ranch outside Nogales, Arizona Territory, was all she had left in this world. Sweat trickled down her temple despite the October chill as she paused to survey the land her father had built from nothing, the land she was about to lose. "Miss Evans." The familiar voice of Sheriff Miller carried across the yard, his horse kicking up dust as he approached. Grace knew what brought him. The tax notice had arrived 3 weeks prior, and time had run out. Grace set her shovel aside, wiping calloused hands on her worn skirt. At 26, she'd grown accustomed to hardship, but nothing had prepared her for the burden that fell upon her shoulders when influenza took both her parents last winter. The ranch had been struggling even before their deaths, and the back taxes had accumulated beyond her ability to pay. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, squinting against the setting sun, "I suppose you're here about the taxes." The older man removed his hat, revealing thinning gray hair. Sympathy lined his weathered face. "I'm afraid so, Miss Evans. County says they can't wait any longer. $300 due by week's end, or they'll seize the property." $300 might as well have been $3,000. The drought had decimated half her cattle, and the remainder were too thin to fetch a decent price at market. The small savings her parents had tucked away had been depleted by funeral costs and doctor's bills. "I understand," Grace replied, maintaining the dignity her mother had instilled in her. "I'll do what I can." As the sheriff rode away, Grace returned to the house, a modest 2-bedroom structure her father had expanded twice as the ranch had prospered in better years. Inside, she sank into her father's old chair, allowing herself a rare moment of despair. The ranch wasn't just land and cattle. It was her heritage, her home, and the final connection to her family. Morning arrived with no solutions. Grace was feeding the chickens when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Expecting the sheriff returning with more bad news, she was surprised to see an unfamiliar rider coming up the long drive. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rising sun. As he drew closer, Grace noted his worn denim, sturdy boots, and the revolver holstered at his hip, typical cowboy attire, yet something about his bearing suggested he wasn't just another drifter looking for work. "Morning, madam," he called, his voice deep and clear. He dismounted with fluid grace, revealing himself to be younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. "Name's Jake Anderson. I'm looking for the owner of this ranch." "You found her," Grace replied, wary but curious. "I'm Grace Evans." Jake Anderson removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair streaked with sun-bleached strands. "Miss Evans, I heard in town you might be looking for hands to help with the ranch." Grace almost laughed at the irony. "I'm afraid whoever told you that was misinformed, Mr. Anderson. This ranch won't be mine much longer unless I can come up with $300 by week's end." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps. "I see, that's unfortunate. It's a fine spread you have here." "It was my father's pride," Grace said, surprised by her candor with this stranger. "But the drought hit us hard, and after my parents passed, I couldn't keep up with everything." "A ranch is a lot for one person to manage," Jake observed, his gaze traveling over the property with knowing eyes. "Would you mind showing me around anyway? I've ridden a long way, and it would be a shame to turn back without at least seeing what I came for." Grace hesitated. There were chores waiting, and entertaining a cowboy who couldn't possibly help her situation seemed pointless. Yet something about his direct gaze and respectful demeanor made her nod. "I suppose I can spare an hour," she conceded. As they walked the property, Grace found herself telling this stranger more than she'd intended. About her parents, about the difficult years, about her determination to make the ranch work despite mounting obstacles. Jake listened attentively, asking knowledgeable questions about the cattle operation and water sources. "Your father chose good land," Jake remarked as they stood on a ridge overlooking the pastures. "Even with the drought, this valley holds promise." "Promise doesn't pay taxes," Grace replied with a hint of bitterness. Jake studied her for a long moment. No, it doesn't. But good land and hard work should count for something in this world. The next morning, Grace was startled by a knock at her door. Opening it, she found Sheriff Miller on her porch, his expression unreadable. "Miss Evans, I've got news about your property taxes." Grace braced herself. "Has the deadline been moved up?" "No, madam, they've been paid in full." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "Paid? That's not possible. There must be some mistake." "No mistake. A man came to the county office yesterday afternoon and settled the entire debt, including penalties." "You're clear through next year." Grace gripped the doorframe. "Who would do such a thing?" The sheriff shrugged. "Tall fellow, dark hair. Didn't give his name, just paid in cash and rode out. Said to tell you the ranch is yours free and clear and he asks nothing in return." After the sheriff departed, Grace stood on her porch, stunned and confused. Who would pay such a sum for a stranger? The only person who came to mind was Jake Anderson, but she'd known him for barely a day. It made no sense. 3 days passed with no sign of the mysterious benefactor. Grace threw herself into ranch work, determined not to waste the gift she'd been given, whoever it had come from. She was mending a fence when she spotted a rider approaching Jake Anderson returning, his horse moving at an easy lope. "Mr. Anderson," she called as he drew near, her heart inexplicably racing. "I thought you'd moved on." He dismounted, smiling slightly. "I had some business to attend to. Thought I'd stop by and see if that job offer was still open." Job offer for a ranch hand. His eyes held her steadily. "Unless you've filled the position already," understanding dawned slowly. "It was you," she said quietly. "You paid my taxes." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "The sheriff wasn't supposed to describe me." "Why would you do that? You don't know me." $300 is no small sum. "Let's just say I've been in tough spots before," he replied, looking past her to the ranch house. "Sometimes people need a chance, not charity. But you can't simply give away that kind of money and then ask for a job that pays a fraction of what you spent." Jake's expression grew serious. "Miss Evans, I've been riding from ranch to ranch for 15 years. I've saved most of my wages, had nothing else to spend them on. When I heard about your situation in town, it seemed like a good investment." "Investment?" She frowned. "This ranch isn't producing enough to be called an investment." "I didn't mean it like that." For the first time, Jake appeared flustered. "I meant, I've been looking to settle somewhere, put down roots. Your ranch needs work and I need a purpose. Seems we might help each other." Grace studied him, this enigma of a man who'd given so much yet asked so little. Cautious hope stirred within her. "I can offer room and board and $10 a month when we start turning a profit. It's not much." "It's enough," Jake said simply. That evening, Grace showed Jake to the small bunkhouse where her father had once housed several ranch hands during better times. As she helped him settle in, 1,000 questions burned in her mind, but she held them back. Time would reveal what kind of man Jake Anderson truly was. The following weeks brought a transformation to the rocking E. Jake worked from dawn to dusk, repairing fences, tending cattle, and implementing ideas to improve the ranch's prospects. He built a new irrigation system that directed precious rainwater to where it was most needed. He doctored sick calves and strengthened the herd through careful management. Grace found herself working alongside him, their partnership easy and natural despite their different backgrounds. Jake never spoke much about his past, though occasional comments suggested he'd worked ranches throughout the Southwest. He knew horses better than anyone she'd ever met, and his cattle sense was uncanny. As autumn deepened toward winter, Grace realized the ranch was slowly recovering under their combined efforts. More importantly, she was beginning to see a future again, one that increasingly included the quiet cowboy who'd saved her home. One evening in early December, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Grace finally asked the question that had lingered since his arrival. "Why did you really pay those taxes, Jake? The truth this time." Jake was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he spoke, his voice was soft in the gathering darkness. 10 years ago, I worked a spread in Colorado. The owner, Old Man Harrington, treated me like a son, taught me everything worth knowing about ranching. When he died, his daughter inherited, but she was drowning in debt he'd kept hidden. By the time I found out how bad things were, the bank had already foreclosed. He stared into the distance. I had money saved, but not enough. I couldn't help her. The land was sold and she moved back east to live with relatives. Grace waited, sensing there was more. I promised myself if I ever had the chance to prevent someone else from losing their home, I would. When I heard about your situation in the saloon in Nogales, it felt like fate. He turned to her, his expression earnest in the fading light. But I never expected to find a place that felt like it could be home, or someone I'd want to stay for. The air between them changed, charged with unspoken feelings. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as Jake's gaze held hers. I should turn in, he said abruptly, standing. Early start tomorrow. Grace watched him walk to the bunkhouse, confusion and disappointment mingling within her. Something was growing between them, something neither seemed ready to acknowledge. Winter arrived with unexpected ferocity that year. A blizzard swept down from the north, blanketing the ranch in 2 feet of snow and sending temperatures plummeting. Grace and Jake worked desperately to bring the cattle into sheltered areas, but several animals were lost to the storm. During the worst of the blizzard, they found themselves trapped in the barn, the wind howling outside like a living thing. They'd created a small nest in the hay, wrapped in horse blankets beside a carefully monitored lantern. Never seen a storm hit this hard this early, Jake commented, his breath visible in the chilled air. Grace huddled closer for warmth, trying to ignore the awareness that flared whenever they touched. My father used to tell stories about a blizzard that struck before I was born. Said it was so cold the chickens' eggs froze solid in their nests. Jake chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her shoulder. My pa had similar tales, never knew which ones to believe. You don't speak of your family often, Grace observed, not much to tell. Pa was a drifter who never stayed anywhere long. Ma died when I was 12. I started working ranches at 14, been doing it ever since. No place ever felt like home. His eyes met hers in the lantern light. Not until recently. The confession hung between them, neither willing to be the first to breach the final distance. They fell asleep side by side, and when Grace woke in the gray dawn, she found herself curled against Jake's chest, his arm protectively around her shoulders. The storm passed, leaving a transformed landscape in its wake. As Christmas approached, the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. One afternoon, Jake rode to town for supplies and returned with an unexpected gift, a small pine tree tied to his saddle. Thought you might want to celebrate properly, he explained as he set it up in the parlor. Grace was touched beyond words. Last Christmas had been a somber affair, her parents recently buried and her future uncertain. It's perfect, she managed, blinking back tears. Together, they decorated the tree with the few ornaments Grace's mother had cherished, plus some Jake had fashioned from wood and painted with surprising skill. That evening, by the light of candles and the crackling fire, Grace found the courage to take a step toward what her heart increasingly wanted. I've been thinking, she began, setting aside her mending. The bunkhouse must be terribly cold these winter nights. Jake looked up from the bridle he was repairing. I've slept in worse conditions. Still, it seems foolish to heat 2 buildings when this one has an empty bedroom. His hands stilled. Are you offering me your father's room? I'm offering you a proper place in this house, Grace said carefully. The ranch is doing better because of your work. You've earned more than cold nights in the bunkhouse. Something flickered in Jake's eyes, hope, perhaps, or caution. People in town might talk. People always talk. I'm more concerned with what's right. She held his gaze steadily. You saved this ranch, Jake. You should share in its comforts. The next day, Jake moved his few possessions into the house. The dynamics between them shifted, subtly sharing meals at the same table, passing in the narrow hallway, hearing each other move about in adjacent rooms. Grace found herself hyper-aware of his presence, noticing small details she'd missed before. How he hummed tunelessly while shaving, the way he always removed his hat before entering a room, his habit of reading by lamplight late into the evening. As winter deepened, they fell into domestic patterns that felt increasingly natural. Jake taught Grace to play chess using a set he carved from scraps of wood. She showed him how to make her mother's special Christmas cookies. They spent evenings reading aloud from Grace's small library, discovering a shared love for adventure stories. One night in January, a particularly bitter cold snap froze the pump. Jake spent hours in the biting wind fixing it, returning to the house with his hands nearly blue from cold. Without thinking, Grace took his frozen fingers between her warm palms, rubbing them gently. "You'll catch your death out there," she scolded softly. "Worth it to keep water flowing to the stock," he replied, but his voice hitched as her fingers continued their gentle ministrations. Their eyes met, and the careful distance they'd maintained dissolved. Jake's free hand rose to touch her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "Grace," he murmured, her name a question and a plea. She answered by leaning forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started tentative but quickly deepened with months of unspoken longing. His arms encircled her, drawing her against his chest as though she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the day I met you. Why did you wait so long?" she whispered. "I didn't want you to think I expected anything for helping with the ranch. I needed you to be sure." Grace touched his face, tracing the lines etched by sun and wind. "I am sure. About you, about us." Spring arrived early that year, bringing new life to the rocking E. The cattle Grace and Jake had carefully tended through the winter produced a healthy crop of calves. The irrigation system Jake had built channeled the seasonal rains efficiently, resulting in lush pastures. For the first time since her parents' deaths, Grace felt genuine hope for the ranch's future. Their relationship blossomed alongside the land. Jake remained in the main house, though propriety dictated they maintain separate bedrooms until they could formalize their arrangement. Town gossip inevitably followed, but Grace found herself caring less about others' opinions than her own happiness. One evening in May, Jake returned from a trip to town unusually quiet. He performed his chores mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. After dinner, he suggested a walk to the ridge that overlooked the valley. As they stood watching the sunset paint the landscape in gold and crimson, Jake turned to Grace with uncharacteristic nervousness. "I've been thinking about our future," he began, his voice low. "About what we're building here together." Grace's heart quickened. "As have I. I want you to know I never planned this when I paid those taxes. I just wanted to help someone who deserved a chance." He took her hands in his, but every day since then has been a gift I never expected. From his pocket, he withdrew a small band of gold. "This was my mother's. It's simple like she was. I've carried it all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." His eyes, vulnerable and hopeful, met hers. "Grace Evans, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears sprang to Grace's eyes as she nodded, words momentarily beyond her. "Yes," she finally managed. "Yes, Jake Anderson, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into a kiss that sealed their promise. When they parted, Grace laughed softly. "From the moment you rode onto this ranch, and then paid my taxes without asking anything in return, I think part of me knew this day would come." They married in June, beneath the cottonwood trees that lined the creek running through the rocking E. The ceremony was small Sheriff Miller and his wife, the pastor from Nogales, and a handful of neighboring ranchers who'd come to respect the couple's determination and hard work. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her taller frame. Jake, unaccustomed to formal attire, nevertheless cut a handsome figure in a new suit purchased for the occasion. When they spoke their vows, the sincerity in their voices moved even the most stoic attendees. "I promise to be your partner in all things," Jake vowed, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "To build our legacy together on this land and to cherish you every day of our lives." Grace responded with equal conviction. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever comes our way, to honor the gift you gave me without expectation, and to love you with my whole heart until my last breath." Life as husband and wife brought both joys and challenges. Their first year of marriage saw the ranch prosper under their joint management. Jake's experience with livestock and Grace's head for figures proved a formidable combination. They sold calves at the fall market for the highest prices the Rocking E had commanded in years, allowing them to hire 2 ranch hands and expand their operations. They also began making improvements to the house, adding a larger kitchen where Grace could preserve the bounty from her expanded garden, and building a proper office where they could manage the ranch's growing business. Jake surprised Grace on their first anniversary by converting the small room adjacent to their bedroom into a library, with floor-to-ceiling shelves for her beloved books and comfortable chairs where they could read together in the evenings. Their partnership extended to every aspect of ranch life. Jake taught Grace more about animal husbandry and land management than her father had ever shared, treating her as a true equal rather than sheltering her from the harsher realities of ranching. In turn, Grace introduced refinements to their home and business that Jake, with his years of transient living, had never considered important. The winter of 1887 brought the news that Grace was expecting their first child. Jake's reaction was a mixture of elation and terror that made Grace laugh and cry simultaneously. "What if I'm no good at being a father?" he worried one night as they lay in bed, his hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. "You will be wonderful," Grace assured him. "You have so much love to give, Jake. I've seen it in everything you do." "My own pa wasn't exactly a shining example," he admitted, "left us more often than he stayed." Grace turned to face him in the darkness. "You are not your father. You've proven that by creating a home here, by keeping your promises, by building something lasting." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Jake became increasingly protective, hiring extra help so she could rest more. Though she protested being treated like fragile china, she secretly appreciated his concern. The small community around Nogales rallied around them, with neighboring ranch wives providing advice and support as Grace prepared for motherhood. In late September, after a labor that tested both their endurance, their son was born, a healthy boy with Jake's dark hair and Grace's determined chin. They named him Thomas James Anderson, after both their fathers. "He's perfect," Jake whispered, cradling his newborn son with hands that routinely broke wild horses yet now trembled with the precious weight they held. "He is," Grace agreed, exhausted but radiant, "and he has your eyes." Parenthood transformed them both. Jake, who had once defined himself by his ability to move on whenever necessary, became anchored to the ranch and his family with unshakable devotion. Grace, who had feared she might lose her independence in marriage, discovered instead a deeper strength in shared responsibility. The following years brought both growth and hardship. A second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Rose, joined their family in 1889. The ranch expanded as they purchased neighboring land when it became available, increasing their herd and diversifying into horses as well as cattle. They weathered another drought that tested their resources and resilience. When financial pressures mounted, they faced them together, sometimes staying up late into the night to find solutions that would keep their ranch solvent without sacrificing what they'd built. Through it all, they never forgot how their story began with a selfless act that asked for nothing in return but ultimately gained everything. In the spring of 1895, 10 years after Jake had first ridden onto the rocking E, they stood together on the ridge overlooking their property. The ranch had grown substantially new corrals, an expanded barn, additional grazing land stretching toward the mountains. Their children played in the yard below, their laughter carrying on the breeze. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. At 36, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew her worth and her place in the world. Jake, his hair now bearing threads of silver at the temples, wrapped his arm around her waist. "Not in my wildest dreams. I was just looking to help someone who deserved it." "You got more than you bargained for," she teased. "Best bargain I ever struck." He turned her to face him. "Do you remember what the sheriff told you when he came to say the taxes had been paid, that you asked for nothing in return?" Grace smiled at the memory. "Little did either of us know what would come of it. I asked for nothing but received everything," Jake said softly. "A home, a purpose, a family, things I'd stopped believing were possible for someone like me." "They were always possible," Grace replied, touching his face tenderly. "You just needed to stay in one place long enough to let them find you." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the land they'd nurtured together. Jake and Grace Anderson returned to the house that had become the heart of their shared life. The Rocking E Ranch, once nearly lost to unpaid taxes, now stood as a testament to what could grow from a single act of kindness with no expectations. Over dinner that night, surrounded by their children's chatter and the comfortable signs of their life together, Grace caught Jake's eye across the table and saw in his gaze the same certainty she felt in her heart that some debts, while they might begin with money, could only truly be repaid in love given and received freely, year after unexpected year. In the decades that followed, the Anderson family became fixtures in the Nogales community. The Rocking E grew into one of the most respected ranches in the territory, known for quality livestock and fair business practices. Jake and Grace's children learned the value of hard work and integrity by their parents' example, eventually taking over ranch operations as Jake and Grace grew older. Thomas, their firstborn, combined his father's ranching knowledge with a head for business that expanded the Rocking E's influence throughout southern Arizona. Eleanor, their daughter, possessed Grace's compassion and determination, establishing the first proper school in their rural district and ensuring local children received an education regardless of their circumstances. Two more children joined their family in later years: Robert, born in 1892, who grew up to become a veterinarian serving the entire county, and Margaret, their youngest, who arrived unexpectedly in 1896 and eventually married the son of a neighboring rancher, connecting two of the oldest families in the region. As Arizona moved toward statehood in the early 1900s, Jake and Grace watched their world transform. Automobiles began to appear alongside horses on Nogales streets. Telephones connected the once isolated communities. The railroad brought new opportunities and challenges to ranchers throughout the territory. Through it all, the foundation of their life remained unchanged: the love that had grown from a stranger's kindness. The partnership forged through shared struggles and triumphs, the home they'd built together on land that had nearly slipped away. On quiet evenings, long after their children had grown and started families of their own, Jake and Grace would often sit on their porch watching the sunset, their hands clasped together as naturally as breathing. They'd remind each other of the day they met, of the tax debt that had seemed insurmountable, of the cowboy who had asked for nothing but ultimately received everything worth having. And in those moments, they knew with absolute certainty that the greatest fortune they possessed had never been measured in dollars or acres, but in the life they'd created together at the Rocking E Ranch, all because one man had been willing to pay a debt that wasn't his, and one woman had been brave enough to build a future with him.